Good afternoon. This is Michael Halpern with the Unit of Concerned Scientists. I want to thank everyone for joining us and our panel today. I'm not going to take up too much time with bios because you've had a chance to see that in your email, but I did want to set the stage for the conversation that we're going to have today. And I think we're going to have three fairly brief presentations from our three presenters and then open it up to questions, which you can type into the chat function on your screen, or if you're having trouble with the interface, you can always email them or tweet them using the hashtag SafeScience, or email them to SciNet, SCINET, at ucsusa.org. And I'll give that out a couple more times throughout the hour that we have together. So the three people we're hearing from, Michael Mann, who's a climate scientist at Penn State. Mika McKinnon is a geophysicist and science reporter. Ramon Barthelemy is a survey scientist at the American Institute of Physics. And all three of the experts you're going to hear from today I kind of agree with UCS that it's important for scientists to be able to engage with the public. And if you've joined this webinar, I'm guessing you have a strong interest in sharing your expertise in your research with the public. And for a lot of scientists, the biggest stumbling blocks that they face are time and training. But every once in a while, scientists find themselves the targets of different types of harassment, whether it's for their research or for their identity, and we want to figure out how we build resilience to those kinds of attacks. One thing we find at UCS is that a lot of scientists don't really think about what they would do until they're the deer in headlights. And so we've prepared some materials for scientists to think about beforehand what their course of action would be if they're going to be encountering different types of scrutiny. We have developed a scientist guide for scrutiny that we co-developed with leading experts to help people think through how they would deal with different situations, and that's available on the UCS website, and I'll tweet it out momentarily on that hashtag SafeScience. We've also highlighted how some state open records laws enable different special interests to attack scientists, and have that report available on our website as well. But I think the goal of today's conversation with Michael and Mika and Ramon is to really help all of you think through and understand how and why scientists are harassed, to begin to develop your own personal plan to deal with harassment, and to explore creating safe spaces within your own spheres of influence so that all scientists around you have the ability to thrive. So we're going to keep this pretty informal. Again, you can tweet questions using the hashtag SafeScience. You can type them into the chat function. We got a good number of questions from people who, when they signed up for the webinar. So when we get to that point, I'll be interspersing those as well. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mike Mann for his thoughts.
Okay, thanks very much. It's good to be with you all. So my name is Michael Mann. I am a professor here at Penn State University, and I'm also fairly involved in the larger public discourse over human-caused climate change and what to do about it. I found myself in the fray at the center of the very fractious debate over climate change because of a graph that I published while still a postdoc back in the late 1990s, the so-called hockey stick graph that depicts temperature changes over the past 1,000 years, and it demonstrates how anomalous and unprecedented modern warming is in a long-term context. And it became sort of iconic in the climate change debate back in the late 1990s. And what I didn't realize was that once we published that iconic, soon-to-be iconic graph, I would find myself again at the center of this storm, this very contentious battle over climate change, simply because of the implications of our findings. They were inconvenient to some of the powerful special interests who don't want to be forced to do anything about climate change, fossil fuel interests who profit greatly from our continued use of fossil fuels and don't want to see us transition away from our reliance on fossil fuels. And because of that, I experienced what I would describe as a crescendo of attacks from the late 1990s, soon after we published this graph. Then it was featured in the Summary for Policymakers of the third assessment report of the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And with that, it really did become an iconic graph. I soon found myself attacked on the editorial pages of the Wall Street Journal, conservative media outlets looking to discredit the hockey stick would often seek to do so by attacking me personally. Now, I had two senior co-authors on the original articles that presented the hockey stick, but I think I was seen as the most vulnerable. I was the first author, and I was just a postdoc at the time that this work was published and at the time it became so prominent. And I found myself at the receiving end of quite a bit of scrutiny. In fact, many of the episodes that I have lived through are actually factor significantly in the document that Michael described, or Justin described, about the various sorts of attacks that scientists have been subject to and how to deal with them. Well, in my case, it was sort of trial by fire. There was no such document at the time, and my experiences, I like to think, have helped create a sort of a template that other younger scientists can now draw upon in figuring out, what works and what doesn't when dealing with these sorts of motivated attacks on science. And they took the form of me being in the hot seat in congressional hearings with James Inhofe, famous climate change denier in the U.S. Senate. Joe Barton was the chair of the House Energy and Commerce Committee back in 2005. He tried to subpoena all of my personal emails in an effort to find something to discredit me, to discredit the hockey stick graph. This was right before a very important Senate vote on climate change, and it was clear that there was an effort to try to discredit the scientific underpinnings of climate change by discrediting the hockey stick and by discrediting me personally. It might not be surprising to you to learn that James Inhofe and Joe Barton were the largest or among the largest recipients in the U.S. Senate and the U.S. House of Representatives from the largest recipients of fossil fuel money, and we're essentially doing the bidding of those powerful interests in attacking me and trying to undermine the science. After that, I managed to live through those episodes thanks to groups like UCS who were there to help young scientists like myself who did experience a deer in the headlight moments, and it was important that there were trusted institutions and individuals that we could go to for advice. And I had senior colleagues like Steve Schneider, who unfortunately is no longer with us, that I could turn to for advice, but there were groups like UCS that were there to help as well. And that's been critical because often scientists, young scientists like I was at the time, don't know where to go. They don't know who they can trust. It's really critical that there are trusted institutions that are there and ready to help. And I have continued to experience attacks like the Attorney General of Virginia, Ken Cuccinelli, the former Attorney General, once again sort of taking a page out of the classic climate change denial handbook, in fact specifically from Joe Barton, tried to subpoena all of my personal emails, again to try to find something to discredit me with. The UCS weighed in almost immediately against that civil subpoena. It helped garner support from other scientific institutions. The scientific community spoke loudly and clearly that this sort of, these sort of witch hunts aimed at discrediting scientists whose findings might be inconvenient to powerful vested interests that fund these politicians' campaigns, that wasn't acceptable. And the scientific community spoke out strongly, and ultimately we prevailed once again. And the forces of disinformation and denial ultimately were defeated, but that was only because there were institutions like UCS, the National Academy of Sciences, the AAAS, others weighed in soon thereafter. I think it was critical that UCS weighed in first, and once UCS had weighed in, then other scientific voices and institutions felt that they could, that they had the space now to weigh in themselves. And I prevailed, and ultimately it has turned me sort of into a warrior. It's not what I signed up for when I decided to major in physics and applied math as an undergraduate and went off to study theoretical physics in graduate school, eventually getting into climate science. Little did I know that that was a career path that would take me to the center of one of the most fractious and contentious societal battles that we've ever had to deal with, one over what is perhaps one of the greatest threats that we face, the threat of human-caused climate change. And though it's not what I signed up for, I ultimately decided that there's really no more important task that I could devote my life to than trying to inform this very important discussion. And it has led me to develop very close friendships and alliances with other groups like UCS that are trying to do the same thing. So, it's not what I signed up to do when I decided to go into science, but once I found myself there, I decided that it was a noble pursuit to use whatever prominence that I had acquired through my various battles and travails, to use that prominence to give myself a voice in this very important discussion. And hopefully I can answer questions that some of the scientists who are part of this call might have about my experiences and what I've learned from them, and what advice I have to younger scientists today who find themselves under similar, for lack of a better word, scrutiny.
Great. Thanks, Dr. Mann. Again, this is Michael Halpern with the Unit of Concerned Scientists. I'm facilitating this call. For those who joined a little bit later, you can use the chat function to ask questions or ask questions via the hashtag SafeScience. Next, we're going to go to Mika McKinnon, who will introduce herself and talk a little bit about her perspective on this issue.
All right. Hello. My name is Mika McKinnon, and I am a freelance scientist doing science in physics. This means that by communicating science out there, it's a lot of exposure to what can go wrong. The most important thing to understand about any sort of harassment is it's not about you, and you cannot prevent it. It's the more success you have, the more exposure you have, the more reach your science has, and those are all good things. But it also exposes you to more people who might take offense at it. And they might take offense at your science, or they might take offense at who you are, or they might hate that you had a typo in the third line of your abstract. You can't justify or predict how they're going to react, and it isn't your fault. However, that does also mean it has a real impact, that even though it has nothing to do with you doesn't mean it doesn't impact you. You can have a reputational impact like Michael was talking about, or it could be an emotional impact or a physical impact. So we're talking about hard stuff that is potentially very upsetting for one's life. So I have illustrated everything with an adorable little hedgehog, because we all need a bit of cute to offset the seriousness. And because little hedgehog will not attack anybody, but he has the spines to protect himself. So if we can go to the next slide there. Although you cannot prevent harassment, you can prepare against it. It sounds silly, but looking at operational security ideas apply really, really well. So you can restrict access to vulnerable information. There are a bunch of tools and websites to do this with. You can clean out anything that has your address, your phone number, things that make you more vulnerable to other people. It can also just be things you care about that somebody might use as an attack point. You can increase your security by having things like two-factor authorization on all of your accounts. You can use strong passwords and a password manager to remember them all for you. You can talk to friends and family and teach others so you have a support network and so they don't accidentally expose you or make things worse. Trying to do everything is overwhelming. It's too much. So you have to pick and choose what is reasonable for you, what risks you are willing to take. I have chosen to allow myself more exposure as to who I am, who my personality is, by talking in public with my real voice, with my real curiosities and passions. That gives people the opportunity to insult or attack things I care about outside of my work, but that's a choice I made. That's a risk I take. There are some beautiful guides out there to step you through things. The most useful for when you are just getting started is that Crash Override has put together an app that will lead you through locking down security on your Facebook, on your Twitter, on your email. How do you set up two-factor authorization? What does that mean? All of these things, it will guide you through it one step at a time. So it's an amazing resource. I highly recommend it. It is not silly to do these strategies now. If you do things in advance, you have things locked down beforehand, or you know what your risks are, or you know what your strategies are, and you're not scrambling in the face of an attack. Next slide, please. So you can respond to harassment. We talk a lot about don't feed the trolls, because doing psychological research on trolls, the data says that when you give them attention, they get worse. This is particularly true when you're dealing with somebody who's a public figure, if you're dealing with somebody who they're attacking you because of what you do in public, which is, as scientists, we're concerned that people will attack us because of our research. With that is often more about dominance and control, so it is about attention. That doesn't mean you need to silently take their abuse. You can call it out. You can say this is wrong. You can ask for help. You can tell your workplace this thing is happening. One of the most common impacts of suddenly being targeted is self-reproach. It's a sense of shame, a stigma, an anxiety that you did something to cause this. You didn't. It is a random act of the universe where you just happened to roll the dice wrong and got stuck. It's not your fault. So you can reach out, you can get help, you can solicit others to take over filtering your email for a while, to reporting abuse on social media that is happening in public. It is really important to record and report everything. The details of what is illegal changes by your jurisdiction, so find out what it is in your area. But even if it isn't, even if you're in somewhere that doesn't believe online harassment is real harassment yet, haven't caught up to changes in technology, if you document everything, you have a better chance of getting help in the future. So you record it all, you report it all, and you ask for help, because it's too much for any one person to deal with. Nobody can deal with constant hatred, constant attacks for even brief periods of time. It is fine to ask for help. And it is fine to have different people that you vent to or cry to, or to deal with the handling of your social media, or whatever it is that you need help with. Is understand what your self-care is and get that assistance. Next slide, please. Oops, went too far. The last chunk is, this is not a hopeless situation. We can change culture. We are already having major changes in culture in response to high-profile harassment events. Also, thankfully, when we start looking at the research, kind communities are self-perpetuating. We are seeing data that if you have a well-moderated comment section, you bring in more people who are good and kind and reasonable, who want to help out and share ideas together. That when you build an online network of decent humans, you get even more of them. So when you exclude the trolls, when you get rid of the harassers, when you remove that tiny percentage of terrible people, you do much better about having a more positive and more interesting culture. It is entirely possible when you're working that there might actually be genuine miscommunications. If you try and de-escalate, it can work. It really can. You really can convert and change ideas. It's one of the reasons people do science in public, is to try and have those true, earnest engagements. The laws are changing all over the place. We can advocate for more. That is one of the things we can do with the Union of Concerned Scientists, is ask them for our help in collecting our voices together and advocating for change. And we can help each other out. We are not in this alone. is all I've got to say for now. I will join you again during the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Mika. I think that's a really great point, that you don't have to go it alone. And I would just add that we end up learning a lot from all of the different attacks that we've seen, and we see what kind of strategies work and what strategies don't, and how we all become more resilient. And so I think we're better off than they were 2 years ago and 5 years ago, as we kind of see what kind of methods are used, and we try to make it make the science community more resilient to these kinds of attacks. So thanks with that. This is Michael Halpern again with the Unit of Concerned Scientists moderating. You can ask questions for any of our panelists by typing it in the chat, or using the hashtag #SafeScience. We'll get to the question and answer period after we hear from Ramon, who's up next. Go ahead, Ramon.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for having me. My name is Ramon Barthelemy, and I am from the American Institute of Physics. I've spent my career studying issues of equity and the lives of physicists, with a focus on, unfortunately, harassment. And what we heard from the other two speakers was the kind of harassment that's coming from outside of the sciences towards us for the work we do online and the work we do to help change our environment and promote better education in society. Unfortunately, there's a strong amount of harassment that's coming from within the scientists, from scientist to scientist, professor to student, and student to student. My qualitative work, focusing on the experiences of women in physics and astronomy trying to complete their graduate programs, found a huge range of harassment experience, from small things such as being ignored, talked over, or shunned from study groups, to large things such as being in physical danger, being stalked, and sexually harassed. What was common throughout these experiences was that these women were met with silence when they tried to discuss what was happening, find solutions, and work with the professors at hand. My further work, using surveys to study the lives of LGBT physicists, found similar trends. We found that over a third of all the physicists had considered leaving their careers or their majors within the last year, LGBT, of course, being lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender. When we look to the literature overall, we find that roughly 58% of women experience harassment within their workplace. In the sciences, that number is 71%. The survey on LGBT physicists found that 22% of people who reported harassment or discrimination due to their identity as an LGBT person. But what was interesting when we broke this down was that men experienced the least amount and gender nonconforming experienced the most amount. So if you're gender nonconforming, over 60% of the respondents had experienced harassment, and about half of women and about half of all transgender participants. So you see that the layering of identities within the sciences causes additional harassment and additional issues. The more someone doesn't look like the norm, the more they experience these hardships within their career, which is, of course, unfair to their development, especially considering all of the calls we currently have to diversify the field. When we think about this issue, though, in our departments, in our workplaces, in our faculties, we need to reframe the conversation on how we talk about harassment. We do need to continue talking about what is harassment, how to prevent it, and how to respond to it, and the consequences that exist. But we also need to think about what we can do in advance to prevent it. So rather than just having the survivors shouldering the weight of harassment, we need to have everyone proactively think about what is harassment, what is building inclusivity, and how to create a community in which everyone can thrive. And for faculty members and students, this is a little simpler than in industry, because you can require training for all graduate students and all faculty at the beginning of the academic year to understand what proper communication looks like, understand what is harassment, and how to avoid it. It's also critical to bring in professionals to teach about things like microaggressions. These are the small, subtle day-to-day slights, but they can have a huge impact on someone's career. Death by 1,000 paper cuts, as it were. But reforming this narrative is critical so that everyone realizes that they have to do their small part to prevent harassment, from how they interact with people, to observing to what's going on, to reporting what's happening. And a lot of these tactics can be transferred to industry as well. Because in industry, these same sorts of trainings can happen for staff, for bosses to their employees, and from employees to their bosses, because harassment happens at every level and between people for many different reasons, but oftentimes it is tied to identity, such as your sexual orientation, your gender, or your race. And with that, I'm excited to answer some of your questions along with my two other colleagues.
Thanks, Ramon. I think that was a great set of introductory talks. I really appreciate it. Again, this is Michael Halpern with the Union of Concerned Scientists. Do put in your comments and questions in the chat function. I'm going to start off with one that we received via email in advance, and this kind of relates to the inter-scientific community issues. One participant wrote in, I'm a female scientist. What are some tips you have to respond to male scientists who call you, quote, hostile, end quote, when you voice your scientific knowledge even when you're not being hostile? Who wants to take that?
So tone is one of those areas in which women can't win. No matter how we present our voices, no matter how we present our clothing, no matter how we interact with others, we lose. If you are emotional about it, you're too passionate and too intense, need to step it back. If you are unemotional, you're cold and hard. If you're authoritative, you're bossy. If you present things as questions, you're insecure. Like, there's no winning at all. All we can do is try and change the culture. So for that one, having allies works really well. We've just recently had a news cycle that's been talking about the power of amplification. Well, that's an idea that's been around for a little while, of teaming up with allies who confirm and reaffirm of what you said, of, yeah, just like so-and-so just said, the exact same idea again. It's getting that affirmation, that justification that, hey, the team and the group thinks this thing, so you're going to fall in line and acknowledge that was a valid point.
Another strategy you can have in your workplace or department is to talk to the person. So if it's a small thing and you're experiencing it as harassment, as a microaggression, have a conversation with them if possible, and just explain, I'm experiencing it this way, I'm not sure how you mean it, but we should resolve this. Also, if there's some sort of behavior or physical behavior that you don't like, a first step is to say, you know what, this makes me feel uncomfortable, I don't like it when you do X, Y, Z, could you please stop? And of course, if they won't stop and they won't listen, then it has to go to higher level issues.
Absolutely. One of the first things you need to do is actually directly address behavior. This is on any scale, any level. If you don't tell people directly what you need and want, then it doesn't count. And that is, if you have more severe harassment instead of just disagreements and microaggressions and irritations, it doesn't count as telling them. It is not obviously harassment until you tell them you don't like it and don't want it.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. That there's a line that some people don't necessarily realize that their behavior is aggressive or harassment or marginalizing, and that kind of clarity helps a lot. To Mika's point about the amplification, there was a great article in the Washington Post about how women within the Obama administration, especially early on, specifically used the strategy of amplification and seconding each other's comments to make sure that their ideas were heard and not co-opted. I think there's a little bit of questions coming in about precise the sort of microaggression question and some confusion about what that actually means, as well as some question about whether or not trainings that are compulsory or short, whether they actually make any difference in terms of behavior. What is the we're a bunch of scientists here. What is the actual evidence that these kinds of trainings work? Do you want to take any of that, Ramon?
Unfortunately, there's not a lot of good research on that particular area. But when we're trying to combat harassment and build an environment of inclusivity, it's not about just one training. And I should have mentioned this in my talk, so I'm glad it came up in the question. It's about creating an overall culture of inclusivity. It's about including groups on the flyers that you send out who are underrepresented. Particularly in physics, we have issues with race and gender. And it's important to think about how do you actually build a diverse community, because when you have a lot of different kinds of people, it creates an environment where people sort of have to work together and differences is seen as the norm. And one of the critical steps in that is for faculty in universities, but also hiring agents in industry, to actually go to places that you don't normally go to recruit people. So if you're a physics department and you want more diversity and want to create a more inclusive, broad environment, actually go to the Black student groups, go to the LGBT groups, go to the Hispanic groups, go to the women groups or women in science groups at your institutions and recruit there. And those are the places oftentimes that departments aren't recruiting. But by making it very well known that you want a diverse population and you talk about climate all throughout the year, that's how you build an overall culture. I don't have any empirical evidence to support that claim, so I apologize for that, but that is my perspective from doing this work.
I'm sorry, I have the empirical proof to back you up on that. So there's a whole series of studies, the most recently by Sardanis and Drew came out in, what magazine or journal are we in? Came out in July of this year about looking at the composition of conference organization panels versus the number of speakers. And they found that by having a woman organizing conferences, you have participation of women increase between 75 and 99% at the conference. This is just one paper, but it's part of a greater trend of papers where over and over and over again we're seeing if you want to increase diversity, you increase the diversity of the team making the selections. Humans are simple creatures and our psychology is extremely basic in some ways. People pick people who look like them, who act like them, who are like them. So if you want a particular population to increase in your group, if you want to increase the diversity of women, of the people of color, of people of other gender orientations, of people of particular religions, of ages, of whatever, the very first step that you do is ask and recruit those people to be on the selection group that is building the community. You have them on your hiring teams. You have them on your organization teams. You have them at the higher levels of the organization, and you'll get them appearing at the lower levels just as a natural consequence.
Let me add to that. I agree with that completely. It's Mike Mann. And I think that this also sometimes happens almost subconsciously. And because of that, it means well-meaning people aren't aware of the fact that they're actually doing that. They're selecting people who look like them and think like them. So sometimes just raising awareness among colleagues that, hey, make sure that you're thinking more broadly as you choose the participants in a session at a conference. Just getting people to think about that actively may alert them to the fact that there are some subconscious biases that they're falling victim to.
And so it seems like the general sense is that there are micro sort of supports that kind of get at microaggressions. But what about dealing with people in power, whether they be in human resources or higher up inside organizations or supervisors who aren't supportive? How do you get around? How do you kind of neutralize those kind of points of opposition?
I wish there was a universal answer to that question. Anyone else want to jump in with their solutions to it? Toxic workplaces are rough. For me, I pick my battles. Some places I choose not to work because it is too much to fight that culture, that change, and I can't pick every battle. Other places, if they are receptive to change, if they are receptive to listening, then it is more worthwhile for me to put in the time and the effort to educate and to bring awareness and to work on change. So for me,
are there any, are there institutions, are there scientific societies, are there others that should be getting involved in this space to be able to speak more as an institutional voice so people don't speak as an individual voice?
Mm-hmm.
Have we found any?
I would be the only one answering there. I would like it if others were also jumping in.
Yeah.
Yes, some of the professional organizations are developing more statements of support to varying levels of commitment, enthusiasm, and awareness. It is important to ask your professional organizations to advocate on your behalf. You pay them dues. They work for you. They cannot exist without your consent. So if they aren't doing what you need them to do, call them out. Demand that they serve your population. Demand that they serve your needs.
Member societies can...
I was just going to say it's a wonderful point, and actually we are seeing that very issue play out right now with the American Geophysical Union, where there has been a call from the members of the AGU, which is the largest member society for the earth sciences, atmospheric sciences, planetary sciences. There has been a call for them to dissociate themselves from ExxonMobil, which has spent millions of dollars engaged in attacks against climate science and climate scientists over the years. And once again, the membership is speaking out and saying, we cannot continue to take funding from an organization that attacks our members. Now, if the members hadn't spoken out, if there hadn't been sort of a grassroots effort to raise this issue, then there's little doubt in my mind that the institution itself would not have raised the issue, would not be considering this call for a dissociation.
Member societies can be a critical group in supporting change, and I was part of one such example with the American Physical Society. A lot of LGBT physicists were feeling isolated, left out, and had concerns that weren't being addressed. So they lobbied the American Physical Society, who eventually put together an ad hoc group that did research. I was the main researcher, and offered policy recommendations that eventually were adopted by the American Physical Society and are now the law of the land in physics, on how we can better support LGBT physicists and how LGBT folks need to be treated at conferences with respect.
There's also been a lot of debate recently about whether or not the American Astronomical Union, or Society, AAS, should be involved in actively speaking about Black Lives Matter and about the current racial tensions within the United States. These are conversations that are happening now, and they're happening because members are demanding these conversations.
Great. So I'm going to shift gears. So when we're talking about individual harassment at this point, when a question comes in, when good science becomes contentious or controversial in a public space, when you have legitimate powers like members of Congress or newspapers or well-known newspapers who are attacking individuals, what are the best ways to reframe the conversation to get others to see your side? Where do you respond and how do you respond? Where do you start?
Well, I'm happy to try to tackle that. As I remarked earlier, it's really important that you get input from trusted colleagues and institutions like UCS, that you solicit advice before you start weighing in publicly. I think one of the objects of some of these concerted attacks on scientists is to get those scientists to react irrationally, to react in a way where they actually do more damage to themselves and their reputation by not having employed a well-thought-out strategy for responding to the attack. So the first thing is to solicit advice from people that you trust, people who have experience, so that you don't make some initial mistakes. That is also true in a legal sense. If you have been subject to something that looks like a subpoena, a Freedom of Information Act request, solicit advice from legal counsel. There is actually now a group that I helped co-found called the Climate Science Legal Defense Fund that exists to provide advice and help to scientists who find themselves, particularly climate scientists, obviously, who increasingly find themselves subject to legal demands, to subpoenas, to other intimidation mechanisms. It's really important to solicit advice from people who have knowledge and experience so that you don't make any initial mistakes that might come back to haunt you. That having been said, there's a balance here. I do also think that, the famous quote from Mark Twain that a lie can make it halfway around the world in the time the truth is still getting its boots on, is so much more true today than Twain ever could have imagined. And it is important if, allegations, if accusations have been made against you, either regarding the validity of your science or the appropriateness of your conduct, you do need to respond, because a claim that is not responded to, as we know, and we've learned this modern lesson of politics in the sciences, a claim that is not responded to is often assumed to be true. So there's a balance between getting sage advice and being methodical in how you respond, but being timely in how you respond as well, and deciding, and it's often a fine line, when does an attack, when is an attack such that it needs to be responded to immediately, and what sorts of attacks or criticisms are best left for a response, for example, in the peer-reviewed literature. There's often a fine line between, which approach is most appropriate. Sometimes both approaches are necessary. Again, fortunately, there are institutions like the Climate Science Legal Defense Fund and, of course, the Union of Concerned Scientists to provide advice when it comes to matters like this.
I will also say that universities have public relations departments who will help you and will provide media training for you. You can also ask for the university's legal aid and advice, although if you actually get to that point where you are in a situation that is being handled by the law, you will also need your own lawyer who's representing your interests, not your university's interests. Hopefully they will be in alignment, but you need someone who's looking out for you.
Absolutely.
There's actually a lot of conferences will have media relations trainings and workshops. They're really useful to do. So I work as a journalist as well. I'm a science communicator as well. I love talking to scientists. But often when I'm talking to grad students, I realize they have no idea what they're doing. And I have to kind of guide them through the process and go, are you sure you wanted to tell me that? Do you need to check with your PI about whether or not that's a statement you want to be quoted for? Not all journalists are going to take that approach. You can also reach out to journalists to help you tell your story. If you're going to do that, research them. See what type of work they do. See how they've treated this topic in the past. If you've been asked for an interview, check and see, are they somebody who presents issues fairly and tries to understand what the science is, or are you being set up? To be in an interview is an act of trust where you are allowing your words, your image, to be in the editorial control of somebody else. So be careful who you give that trust to.
So some of the themes I'm hearing here, again, this is Michael with UCS, are to not go it alone, to turn to the different entities that can be helpful. I would point out that, or at least highlight, I think, what Mika and Michael were hinting at, is that sometimes the university's best interests do not align with the scientists' best interests, and so you have to be careful there as well. But the university can be a great resource. Scientific societies can be a good resource, scientific groups like UCS. There are some scientific societies, such as the American Geophysical Union, who have started making attorneys available at their annual meetings. And other societies may want to do that kind of thing as well. But I think the point is, ask for help, figure out who's been through this before, do your research into who the reporters are, et cetera, et cetera. There's a question about whether or not basically all publicity is good publicity. Do you feel that attacks, Dr. Mann on you, backfired and ended up raising more public awareness about climate scientists or about climate science? Has attacks on scientists who work on genetically modified organisms led to more or less public understanding of the science in that regard. What do these kinds of attacks ultimately do for public understanding of science, either positive or negative?
Yeah, I'm happy to tackle that. It really depends, and no, all publicity is not necessarily good publicity. Your critics are going to try to do the framing, and this is what effectively happened with the so-called Climate Gate, which was actually the only crime was the theft of scientists' emails and the deliberate misrepresentation of what those emails actually said in a cynical effort to try to sidetrack policy progress on climate change. Your critics will try to do the framing for you. And if you just sort of sit back and behave passively, then that publicity is going to be bad publicity, and it's not going to help you, and it's not going to help the cause of science. It is important, if you are being attacked in a very public way, for you to be engaged and for you to be using all of the tools available to you to help do the framing yourself. And Mika sort of alluded to that there are various avenues available to you, the public relations department of your university, other groups, science groups, of course, like UCS. You do have allies, and those allies are powerful. They can help you get your message out to compete with the framing that is being done by your critics. And so it will not, when you come under attack, when you find yourself in the spotlight, if it's due to an effort to defame you, to misrepresent you, to malign you, to vilify you, then you're going to need to actively participate in the framing and perhaps the reframing of the matter, and you have to make use of the tools available to you, which can be considerable. And ultimately, you've got the most important asset on your side, which is scientific truth. And we like to think that truth does win out in the end, and have some confidence that it will win out in the end. But make sure to not behave passively if you find yourself in one of those situations.
So I'd like to add on to that there is a challenge with people who do not have context, do not know how to filter for good data. This is part of how the climate change debate still seems like a debate when it's overwhelming consensus in one direction, and then a couple of sound bites from the other side is because in an attempt to present fair and balanced, it's being both viewpoints presented as opposed to majority viewpoints presented. One of the ways that you can help change this is to be somebody who is framing science on your social settings, to teach your friends who aren't scientists, yeah, this over here is trustworthy. This over here is based on my judgment, my knowledge, and my understanding. This is true, this is not. And to help share that understanding. It is problematic when that framing does not make it into the media, when you end up with a bad framing in the media presenting your science incorrectly, at which point you really need to use amplification strategies again of having many voices saying, no, this is the right way to interpret this. It's recruit allies, recruit people who will help you spread the framing you're going for.
I agree, and I have to weigh in with a gratuitous plug here. So this is actually a key point that my co-author Tom Tolles and I make in our new book, The Madhouse Effect. Tom is the editorial cartoonist for the Washington Post, and he's done some brilliant cartoons over the years when it comes to anti-science, science denial, and of course climate change and climate change denialism. And there's a wonderful cartoon it's called The Abyss, and it shows, that the truth is not in between. the truth is not in between the scientific community and the forces of disinformation. What lies in between is a chasm, and it's absolutely critical that we do not allow science to be framed as if it's an equal battle between the scientific community on the one hand and a small number of paid advocates for special interests who are doing everything they can to manufacture doubt and controversy. And fortunately, things seem to be changing in that regard, but there has been a tendency within the media to play upon this sort of narrative of false balance. And it's critical, I agree completely with Mika, that we have to fight back against that sort of framing.
So we have a time for a couple more questions. I wanted to just touch briefly again on the defamation issue. One person who I know has had some personal experience with this asked, how should researchers deal with websites that are put up solely to defame them? What can you do in that situation where there's a website out there that is, actively attacking you and you don't have control over that?
So this will depend a lot on jurisdictions of both you and where the web hosts are. However, it gets a lot simpler if they've been foolish enough to use any material that belongs under your copyright. They use your photo, they use excerpts of your work, they embed your graphs, your images. Congratulations, you can do a Digital Millennium Copyright Takedown request. It is much, much faster than pretty much anything else.
And how would you go about learning how to do that? Are there resources out there?
There are a lot of resources out there. Actually, photographers have put together some amazing guides for this because everybody steals photographs all the time. I will have you check and find and pull up and post on the hashtag one of my favorite guides because I don't have it prepped on me right now. But if you just look for DCMA takedown requests, how-to guides, they will step you through it. Any of the really big companies like YouTube or anything like that will have specific forms that you fill out to do it. Again, this doesn't take care of anything. This only takes care of that small subset where they've also paired it with stealing your work with misrepresenting your work in the same terrible package.
Mm-hmm. Great. And I think more generally, I've been learning a good amount too during this discussion, and I think we will commit as UCS to putting together a list of the different resources and websites and other things that have been available, have been talked about during the course of this conversation, and make that available to those people who did RSVP for this webinar or people who are using the Safe Science hashtag. In terms of scientific societies, who's doing it well? Who's helping? The question is, which scientific societies are helping, and which ones do we need to push some more? Someone sent along a web page that the AGU has, harassment.agu.org, which has some good resources there as well. So AGU has started to step up in some ways. Who's doing well?
Yeah, absolutely. AGU is also paired up with the Climate Science Legal Defense Fund to provide sessions on sort of legal issues and making sure that scientists are informed about what their legal rights are and what recourse they have if they find themselves subject to a Freedom of Information request or a subpoena. So AGU has been fairly forward-looking in that regard. AAAS, in my experience, is also quite good in talking about having sessions that deal with those sorts of issues.
I just want to jump back to the reputational thing real fast because there was another chunk of that, which is you can't control what other people are going to say about you. You can control what you say and how you present yourself. So you can't keep people from saying nasty things about you, but you can be a good person, and anyone who knows you will know it's a lie.
Great, thank you. I think the final question that I'll throw out there before we kind of have concluding thoughts from everybody, just what are the main takeaways that we want people to walk away from this from. But I think one question is what are ways that scientists who are not in the spotlight can support others who are doing good science who may be? When you see a scientist who is attacked publicly, what should you do?
You can always help report. When you see abuse happening to scientists, to anyone else, you can report it on the networks that it's happening on. You can speak out about seeing abuse. You can confirm that this is a thing that is happening. When you're a target, sometimes it can be overwhelming and you start wondering, am I imagining this? Is this all a terrible dream? Am I overreacting? And hearing outside voices affirm, this is wrong and shouldn't be happening to you, can make a world of difference.
I would add to that, you can try to make sure that your professional societies are aware of the importance of protecting their fellow scientists and providing providing resources to help scientists fight back against attacks on science, attacks on the scientific sort of endeavor. And scientific societies tend to be fairly conservative. They're not necessarily going to do that if their members don't call upon them to do that. And so there are various ways that you can make your views known to your peers, to the scientific societies, that you consider this an important part of what the scientific society does. It actually defends its members from outside, unwarranted, meritless, politically motivated attacks. It's not necessarily in their nature to do that. They have to be called upon sometimes to step up. And so that's something everybody can do. Everybody can try to make sure that their societies know that this is an important part of what the society should be doing.
Great. So I'm going
to
go ahead.
So one last thing on this is tell people when they're doing good work. Hate comes from everywhere, but compliments are rare. If you're seeing somebody do good work, even if they're a complete stranger, drop them an email or a tweet or tell them in the hallway, hey, I like that figure you did in this presentation. This was a cool idea you came up with. I love how you talk about this thing. Give your genuine compliments. You don't need to hide them.
Amen. It's like a virtual hug. We need to.
Yeah.
Hug a scientist. Great.
Consensually hug a scientist. No strangers are coming up to me and hugging me, please.
That's true. That's true. I'm going to give each presenter just a couple seconds to give a parting shot. But first, before we do that, I wanted just to make sure that everyone knows that they can follow UCS Science Network on Twitter, SciNetUCS, where we've been tweeting out some of the conversation here. And you can find Michael and Mika and Ramon's Twitter handles there as well. Check out Mike's new book. Thanks for being with us. So I'll turn it over to Michael and first, then Mika, then Ramon for a couple of parting sentences before we close.
Well, thanks, and thanks so much for sponsoring this teleconference. I think it's really important that all scientists, particularly younger scientists, understand that there are resources out there, that there are people that they can go to when they find themselves being attacked in various different ways, as we've discussed here. You're not alone, and don't behave as if you are alone. Reach out to trusted individuals and groups like UCS that are there to help you deal with the sorts of attacks that you might find yourself subject to. I had to sort of learn that through trial by fire, and when I found myself sort of suddenly in the fray and being attacked. But fortunately, I had colleagues like Steve Schneider, who had been through that sort of thing, who I could reach out to, and again, scientific groups like UCS who are there to help me in many of my battles. So know that those groups exist and those individuals exist, and reach out to them when you find yourself in this sort of situation, and make sure that your colleagues and your friends, your fellow scientists, know that these resources are available as well, because there is indeed strength in numbers, especially when you've got scientific truth on your side.
Great. Thanks. Mika?
We are small and squishy people in a big and hostile universe. It is overwhelming and scary, but we aren't alone. We can help each other. So be kind to each other. Reach out, provide support, ask for help. Be the good that you want to see.
Great. Thank you. And Ramon, close us out.
In your departments and your workplaces, reframe the narrative of harassment about how people shouldn't be harassers, and frame the narrative around preventing it and building an inclusive community, rather than only a conversation about how to respond to it.
Great, fantastic. So thanks everyone for joining us today. We will get those resources out in due time, and have a wonderful day.
Thanks all.
Thank you.
Thank you. Farewell.